Good evening, everybody. I'm Mary Landers, and I serve as the Director of Alumni Engagement at Uncg. We're so honored to welcome you to this very special homecoming presentation, a North Carolina Travelogue with Elizabeth Hudson. Before we get started, let me take a few moments and provide you with some information to help you fully enjoy the webinar. First, we're thrilled to have over 200 attendees for this session. I think this speaks volumes to Elizabeth's ability to connect with her fellow North Carolinians. You will notice with this webinar format that you are not able to see your fellow attendees. This helps manage the bandwidth and to provide better video for you. You will also notice at the bottom of your screen an icon that says chat. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box. We'll try to get to your question as time permits. Our audience today is composed of UNCG alumni and members of our state travel club. Our common denominator is both the quality of Elizabeth's presentations and love for our beautiful state. Elizabeth is most certainly a woman who really needs no introduction for those of us gathered today. Her role as editor-in-chief of Our State magazine speaks to each of us every month. I think the majority of us would admit that when we receive our new issue of the magazine, we immediately turn to Elizabeth's welcome page. We can always be assured of having a tug at our heartstrings, knowing that Elizabeth will draw us into her life and into the heart of North Carolina. We know Elizabeth as a proud UNCG alumna, author, speaker, editor, daughter, and friend. We couldn't be more honored to have her as one of our keynote speakers. So without further ado, I'm proud to welcome Elizabeth Hudson. She'll certainly put the home in our homecoming. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you, Mary. Oh my gosh, thank you. That was so nice. Hey,
every word is meant.
Happy homecoming. Well, we have really found ourselves in some unusual circumstances this year, haven't we? But as they say, the show must go on. And I am grateful for UNCG's ability to create alternatives for us to get together virtually and still celebrate. I'm excited to see everybody here, and thank you for spending your 5 o'clock hour with me. If you have a beer in your hand or a glass of wine, I think that is just dandy. In the 10 years that I've been editor-in-chief of Our State magazine, I've traveled to all 100 counties in North Carolina. That's 543 miles across the state from Murphy to Manteo. Under normal circumstances, I log about 20,000 miles on my car every year, traveling all over the state from Pinehurst and Mount Airy to Hendersonville and Davidson, from Goldsboro to Asheville and so many places in between. And I will tell you that I have so missed traveling this year. 2 weeks ago, for the first time since March 16th, when we implemented our stay-at-home order and the editorial staff of Our State moved to completely remote work, I drove out of my Greensboro zip code with my mother for a day trip to Blowing Rock. We wore matching masks that I made for us, and we had lunch overlooking the lake at Chatola Resort. When we arrived at the gate, a security guard came over to the car with a temperature reader and pointed it at our heads to clear us for entry. Now, that was different. But also on that day, we watched the swans on the lake, and we saw a couple holding hands on a paddle boat, and we ate our beer-battered pub-style fish and chips. The general manager of the resort is from the UK, and he insisted that Chef Matt of Chatola, who's actually a native of Avery County in North Carolina, get it right. And while I cannot pretend to know much about the authenticity of British food, I tell you our lunch was fantastic and a welcome change from the daily ham and cheese sandwiches I've been making here at home for myself since March. After lunch, my mom and I walked along Main Street in downtown Blowing Rock, and we stopped to admire that beautiful red door on the front of the 102-year-old St. Mary's of the Hills Episcopal Church, and we waited to hear the bells that for 100 years still ring every day on the hour. Then we drove up to Grandfather Mountain. Now, if you've been on that road from the front gate, you know how it winds and turns and switchbacks for 2 miles to the summit, to that mile-high swinging bridge. It was the first time my mom had ever seen it. I took a selfie of us to commemorate our experience there. Well, it wasn't quite the same as the photo I took of us last year at this time, which was at the bonfire at Uncg. But it was still a reminder of what makes a very good day. And the more than anything that I think right now, I think we need to institute for ourselves some very good days. We ended our outing at Grandfather Vineyard, a winery that sits right on the banks of the Watauga River, and we held our glasses of Cabernet and we watched that ice-cold water cascade over those rocks, just as it has done for centuries. And I realized on this trip that 210 days into this pandemic, while many things have changed, there is still so much that has not changed. After all, I got to spend the day with my mother in a beautiful outdoor setting in a state that is so rich with resources and opportunities for exploration and observation, and maybe more important now than ever, reflection. Travel has changed. There's no question about that. I'm planning issues of the magazine for October and November 2021. We work a year in advance because we shoot seasonal photography. And it's hard. We're not knowing if events are going to be canceled, not knowing if restaurants are going to be open. There's still restrictions now that, are causing us some issues for next year's planning. But right now, I'm focusing on the experiences that we can have, the ones that can still make for a very good day if you just know where to look. And so for our time together, I'd like to create for you a virtual tour of North Carolina, from the mountains to the coast, kind of a bucket list in the time of COVID that you can recreate for yourself, hopefully with someone that you like to travel with. You can take notes if you want, and let's uncover 5 itineraries that remind us what's not changed in North Carolina. First, what's not changed in North Carolina? Our trees, changing colors in red and orange and gold, are still magnificent. In the late 1800s, a man named George Washington Vanderbilt traveled to a health spa in Asheville and fell so in love with the mountains and the landscape that he decided to buy all the land in sight. Yes, all of it, 125,000 acres, and build himself a little vacation house that he called Biltmore. He wanted to landscape the grounds and create thick forest and beautiful gardens, but the land, which was old farm fields, was badly eroded and eaten up by cows and scarred from indiscriminate logging. So Vanderbilt enlisted the help of 2 men, Gifford Pinchot and Carl Schenck, to do something so radical it had never been done in the history of America, and that was to create a forestry management plan. Gifford Pinchot became the first chief of the United States Forest Service, and Carl Schenck created America's first forestry school right on the grounds near Biltmore in Asheville. If you've traveled the Pisgah National Forest, then I can tell you the mountains of North Carolina look the way they look today because of the vision that George Vanderbilt had for his new home, and because of his desire to protect and to preserve it. Our trees in North Carolina as the painter Bob Ross would have said, I grew up watching Bob Ross, are happy little trees. And I can point you to so many places in this state where that is so true. Put this one on your list. High up on a mountain in western North Carolina, 4,500 feet in the sky, is a place called the Southern Highlands Reserve, home to a spruce fir forest that is the second most endangered ecosystem in the country. Once upon a time, these spruce trees covered North Carolina, but decades of logging and fires and development took a toll, and the trees started to disappear. But on Toxaway Mountain near Brevard, an incredible stewardship took place just 20 years ago when a couple named Robert and Betty Ballantyne took out a conservation easement to protect 120 acres here. Now, it's not on the scale of Biltmore, but it doesn't have to be. The environmental effect is just as large. Every year, the staff and volunteers here plant red spruce seedlings to rebuild the tree population on top of this mountain. They've already planted 4,000 trees, a huge step in preserving what we love so much about a North Carolina landscape. When you visit the reserve, you'll wander through a series of 8 garden rooms. It's just like being transported into the pages of The Secret Garden. In one section, you'll walk through a 7-ring wildflower labyrinth. You know, you just kind of wind through it. That is just incredible. Kind of how it looks if you want to see overhead. Can you imagine just being right there in that place? I love that image. Another section of the garden is devoted to native azaleas. Still another room overlooks a reflecting pond, and the view is intended to frame 16 different mountain peaks in the distance. Now, unless you're planning to go next week, you'll have to wait for spring to plan a trip to the Southern Highland Reserves. It's cold enough up here that the garden's closed for the winter, but I think we all need things to look forward to these days. And here, it's as magical as it gets. What's not changed in North Carolina? Our rivers are still flowing. At the New River Campground and Canoe in Sparta, about an hour and 45 minutes northwest of Greensboro, near the spot where the shovel first hit the ground in 1935 to build the Blue Ridge Parkway, I climbed into a red Old Town canoe for a trip down the New River. I was really excited and a little nervous because I'm actually not a very good swimmer and I don't have any experience navigating watercraft. But I had a guide who showed me how to hold the paddle and keep my weight distributed. And as we moved through that water, a white-tailed hawk flew overhead, its wingspan massive and majestic. We saw turtles sunning themselves on logs, not a care in the world. And for that moment in time, I didn't have a care either. My paddle just quietly and smoothly moving me forward through this water, the New River, which is curiously named because it's not new at all. In fact, it's the oldest river in North America and thought to be the second oldest river on Earth after the Nile. We are so lucky to have a state full of rivers, 40,000 miles of rivers in North Carolina, from the Nantahala in the mountains to the Neuse in the east, the Lumber River with its knobby-kneed cypress trees that live right in the water, the Cape Fear, which runs 200 miles from where it starts near Raleigh to where it empties south of Wilmington and makes its way to the Atlantic Ocean. You could spend the rest of your days in North Carolina in a kayak, in a canoe, and that wouldn't be so bad, would it? That day on the New River, as we paddled and got near an outcrop of rocks that were jutting up, my guide yelled for me to watch out for obstacles ahead. I panicked a little bit and I said, "What do I do?" And now, in what I believe is the wisdom of the river and maybe of life, my guide turned around and just yelled back, "Don't hit them." If you make this trip to Allegheny County, you're going to see fields of pumpkins. This area is one of the largest producers of pumpkins in the entire country. And you'll see Christmas trees, and your shoulders are going to drop about 4 inches. And I hope you'll find yourself on the water, where it's always going to be a very good day. What's not changed in North Carolina? Our skies are still beautiful. Let me take you to a place in this state that's going to encourage you to look up. 2 hours east of Greensboro, past Raleigh and right off I-95, we're headed to the town of Wilson, which in its heyday was a tobacco town. Now, back in the day, you would have known you're in town when you saw the bright red, 8-foot tall rooster that was bolted on top of the town's water tower. Now, why a rooster? Well, Wilson earned its nickname as Wide Awake Wilson because of the early morning tobacco markets. Auctioneers would show up early to all the tobacco markets to sell pounds and pounds of that golden leaf, as they called it, that built the town. One of those tobacco warehouses was called Center Brick, built in 1896. 60,000 square feet of warehouse space. After tobacco started to wane in the 80s and 90s, these warehouses sat empty. But a few years ago, Center Brick, still owned by the same family after all these years, redeveloped itself and turned the massive warehouse into space for restaurants and apartments and a museum and a visitor center for the crown jewel of Wilson, and the reason that we're here today, that amazing and incredible Whirly Gig Park. Now, I don't know if you know what a whirly gig is. I'll show you. So, as an example, park, they're kind of like windmills, except way taller and with a whole lot more moving parts. This place is unlike anything I have ever seen in North Carolina. It's an outdoor space featuring 31 of these giant rotating kinetic sculptures. Some of them are more than 50 feet in height. They're all made out of scrap metal by a fella named Wallace Simpson. Now, Wallace was quite a Wilson character. He was born in 1919. He was in the Army during World War II, stationed in the South Pacific, and then after he came home, he had a machinery repair shop. After he retired, he started collecting his scraps of old metal and industrial waste from old farm equipment in the 1980s, when he was then about 65 years old, and building these amazing recycled sculptures that I just showed you and putting them outside at his own farm. Now, Wallace died in 2013 at the age of 94 years old, but his legacy lives on in the sky in this quirky and quintessential North Carolina town. Just before he died, the town of Wilson acquired his metal creations to create that incredible park and share what he'd made with the world. And do you know, the North Carolina legislature designated these whirly gigs as the official folk art of North Carolina. Now, I suggest you choose a windy day to travel here so that you can see these things in motion the way Wallace intended. And I can promise you, you won't ever forget it. What's not changed in North Carolina? Our artists are still creating. In the town of Seagrove, about 40 miles south of Greensboro, where the dirt in the ground is that dense red clay, more than 50 potters, the largest concentration of working potters in the United States, sit at their pottery wheels nearly every day and fire up their kilns. They call them turners and burners down here, these artists that are making amazing things with their hands out of the earth at their feet. The drive itself to get here is worth it. Highway 705 was designated a North Carolina Scenic Byway in 1990, one of the first of 51 roads in the state to be recognized for its rural beauty and cultural significance. Along the way, you're going to see those old hand-painted wooden signs nailed to trees, pointing your way to this potter or that one, usually down a dirt road or past some old farm. Sid Luck is a fifth-generation potter down here, fifth generation. He was named a North Carolina Living Treasure, and if you stop at his shop, which is actually in an old barn with dirt floors on his property, he'll give you a lesson in how to throw a pot on the wheel. Now, Sid's good at giving lessons. He was a teacher for 20 years before he got back into the family tradition of pottery. And in fact, he was my high school chemistry teacher. If you've ever been to Seagrove and met Sid, then you know this is who he is. I could watch him throw pots on a wheel all day. And, I've often thought how interesting it is that he was a chemistry teacher, just a perfect background for a potter to have. There's a certain alchemy that goes into the mixing of glazes, the firing of the clay. The whole process is mesmerizing. And it's been going on here in Seagrove exactly the same way for close to 200 years. You'll hear these old family names, the Lucks, of course, Sid Luck, and the Cravens, the Criscos, the Owens, the Teagues, whose families migrated and settled here from Europe, and they saw that the soil was suitable for the same kind of pottery they'd been making in Great Britain. They made preserve jars and jugs for water, or storing other liquids during Prohibition, and plates and mugs and pie dishes. Seagrove really cemented its national reputation, though, in the 1920s, after the founding of Jugtown Pottery, which you can still visit today. A couple named Jacques and Juliana Busby were artists who found an orange pie dish at a fair that they just went crazy for, fell in love with it. They traced its origin to Moore County and found that there were lots more just like it, all being made by these potters I just mentioned. The Busbys had a store in Greenwich Village, New York, and they decided to start selling this pottery that they'd found from North Carolina. People went crazy for it, and they wanted more. So the Busbys started contracting with these Seagrove potters to supply wares for their New York shop. Eventually, the Busbys decided they needed to be closer to the source, and so they founded Jugtown Pottery in 1921. Again, still there, the building's still there, you can walk right in it. And they worked with all those local potters to make pieces for their New York shop. Now, Seagrove Pottery now is in the Smithsonian, but you don't have to go that far to find it. There may be no better time than to make sure we're trying to shop local and support an industry that is truly a family business and a community business. You can spend an entire day down here. I have done it all my life. And when you find a piece that you love, you know that you now own something that is deeply rooted in North Carolina. When I first started my pottery collection 25, 30 years ago, I asked a potter if the soup bowls that I was buying would be okay to microwave. And he looked at me and he said, "Ma'am, these bowls have been fired in a kiln that went to 2,000 degrees. I think they'll be just fine in your microwave." What's not changed in North Carolina? Our shells are still there on our beaches, waiting for us to find them. Now, you probably know traditionally in fall and winter, the crowds start to disperse from the coast. So these days, we're all sensitive to practicing social distancing. And I think these quieter off-season places are going to be especially appealing. Now, I know a secret place that is the epitome of social distance. In fact, you can only get here by boat. It's called Bear Island, It's about a 3.5-mile size barrier island just off Hammocks Beach State Park in Swansboro, about 215 miles east of Greensboro. There's nothing on this island. There's no development, no hot dog stands or amusement parks. But if you're a shell seeker who doesn't mind chilly autumn weather or frigid winter temperatures, you are in for an incredible treat. This is the spot for hundreds of perfectly pristine sand dollars, scattered like gravel all over this untouched beach. Now, if you don't have your own boat, you can do like I did and call up Daryl Marsh, Captain Daryl, and he will be thrilled to put you in his 23-foot skiff if you don't mind sharing a seat with his Labrador retriever named Buxton. Captain Daryl is a one-man show running Marsh Cruises, and he'll hang back in his boat while you spend however much time you want treasure hunting. You're definitely going to find shark's teeth and maybe even a Scotch bonnet, which I hope you know is the state shell of North Carolina. And when you're in a place as beautiful and untouched as our barrier islands are, it's impossible not to be grateful for the gifts from the sea. Shells like these, definitely, but also oysters. What would Eastern North Carolina be like without our oysters, without our soft shell crab? That and so much more. Our unspoiled maritime forest with their live oaks, and our shorebirds and sea turtles that every year make their way back to our beaches for nesting, and our wild horses of Corolla and Shackelford Banks, these amazing creatures, descendants of the wild colonial Spanish Mustangs that, perhaps from shipwrecks or early explorers, found themselves in North Carolina 500 years ago, and yet they still carry on, the ultimate portrait of resilience. And in these spectacular places where sand and sea and sky all come together, it's easy to remind ourselves of the profound and silent joys to be found right in front of our eyes. What's not changed in North Carolina? Our memories of travel will always sustain us. Whether we're thinking of trips we took as children to Tweetsy Railroad for the first time, squealing when the robbers jumped on board the train, or that first time ever seeing the ocean, tasting saltwater spray that splashes up when your dad is showing you how to jump waves. Or maybe you remember your climb up the sand dune at Jockey's Ridge State Park in Nags Head, one of the most beautiful places to see a sunset in North Carolina. Or maybe you recall weekends spent skiing down the slopes in Boone and Banner Elk. You know, it's funny. I think traveling in the time of a pandemic has really caused us to reevaluate things and to shift our priorities to simpler places and destinations. And while I cannot wait for the day when we can return to our normal schedule, when we can safely board an airplane or take a cruise, I'm thinking of the trips in my life that have kept me closer to home and yet somehow have still made the days feel meaningful. Those very good days that I mentioned at the beginning. And a while back, I wrote about one of those very good traveling days. And I thought, in the spirit of homecoming and what it means to travel home, I'd love to close by sharing a bit of that with you. Driving back from Asheville on one of those robin's egg blue sky days and not quite ready to go home, I called an old friend in Asheboro who told me to detour down to her house. She had a convertible, a little white VW cabriolet. They don't make those anymore. And when I got there, she'd already folded the top down and was waiting for me to hop in. Angela and I have been doing this for more than 30 years, since high school. Riding the back roads, we called it back then. Going nowhere in particular, just going. Piling into friends' Mustangs, Firebirds, Trans Ams, Camaros. I got in her car and we set off on our old route, heading down Highway 42. Does anybody actually say highway? No. Roads here are 42, 220, 64, Old 49, past the mall and the old Jones skating rink where we hung out years ago before we finally got real wheels. And as we drove, the town fell away and the landscape widened. Old wooden fences leaning along the side of the road, mailboxes set in gravel by driveways, long abandoned tobacco barns. Seems they don't make those anymore either, caving in at the sides. Cows grazing in pastures, no stoplights to interrupt our ride. For the next few hours, she and I just meandered, drifting along on those curving country roads, our conversation familiar and easy too after all these years, the way it is with a friend who knows you so well. Eventually, Angela and I fell silent. The radio turned off, lulled by the sun on our shoulders and the pleasure of driving these bucolic roads. For so long, this part of Randolph County was, for me, the hub from which everything radiated. I learned to drive on these roads, gripping the steering wheel when the driver's ed teacher, who was also the girls' basketball coach, would open the passenger door to spit out his tobacco juice. I burned up these roads, driving back and forth to friends' houses in Farmer and Back Creek. I eased my car down many dirt roads in pursuit of some weekend field party or bonfire, entertainment in another era. We looped around 220 past Pinewood Country Club, where I rode with my grandparents to the swimming pool every summer, and past Henry James Barbecue, where I'd stop for dinner coming home after classes at Uncg, never dreaming that one day I'd be lucky enough to travel all over this state, logging miles in every town in North Carolina. I'm grateful for all those journeys, but on days like this, in a car with an old friend, I'm happy to retrace familiar paths from home, the well-traveled ones that I carry with me wherever I go. Thank you to everyone for joining Homecoming this year. It's an honor to be here with you all, and I'm excited to answer any questions that you might have.
Elizabeth, that was wonderful. And while people have a moment to put their questions in the chat, I do have a few that people have already sent in by email. So may I read a couple to you?
Please.
How do you or your editorial staff get all the wonderful stories about small towns, unique history, people, and places?
Oh, boy. Well, it's a tall order. We have an incredible editorial staff who, just as I said, a lot of it is we experience what we want readers to experience. All of our editors are in their cars going. This year has certainly been a bit of a challenge for that. But our editors go to every little small town that is in the magazine and experience it for themselves so that we know how to present it. And it's amazing. I've always said we want this magazine to create experiences that you just probably couldn't Google. You might not know, what to even look up. And so when we go to a small town somewhere and eat a cheeseburger that I think is going to blow your mind, or somebody discovers something that they think nobody's going to know about this, it is so exciting and amazing. As I said in my talk, we work a year in advance. And so our editors are planning these small town trips and content for all the issues in 2021. I know one of my editors, her name's Katie King. She's phenomenal, and she plans the downtown section in the magazine and a lot of the front of the book. And she's been going to as many places as she can, even now, even during our some of our travel restrictions, to make sure that that we love every place in North Carolina that we write about.
Before I ask the next question, I hope you can see in the chat box, you have so many positive comments about your stories, and thank you and gratitude for all that you do for our state.
Thank you so much. That's so nice.
Another question that was emailed to us earlier was, do you have a story or experience related to your writing that has touched you and continue to influence your work and your writing?
Oh my gosh, probably so many. It's funny. I write this column every month. I've been the editor-in-chief now for 10 years, so that's 12 issues times 10 years, however many columns that is. I have an English degree, not a math degree. So but I remember the very first column I ever wrote when I became EIC. And it was one of those editor's columns that was, really sort of superficial about what was in the issue. It was an April issue, and I had just kind of written about, and in this issue, you'll see a story on, whatever we had in there at the time. And which is what you see in a lot of magazines, which is fine. And I thought maybe that's what you're supposed to do. And I turned in the column to our publisher, who reads every single word in the magazine every month and chats with me about it every month. And he came over to me and he had my column in his hand, and he kind of said, "Yeah, it's okay, but are you sure this is what you want people to know about you?" Which was to say, I was telling people nothing about me. And I said, okay. And so he didn't tell me to rewrite it. I mean, I probably could have run it and that would have been fine. But I went back to my desk and I sat there and I thought, what in the world am I going to say? What am I going to write about? I haven't traveled internationally. I mean, I feel like I don't have like this big, rich, large life, or at least I didn't think at the time that I had that. Now, of course, I believe that I do. But I sat there at my desk and I was staring out the window, just thinking, what in the world am I going to write? And I was looking at the sky, and it was just, this gorgeous blue sky, just, Carolina blue, really. And all of a sudden, I remembered that I saw that blue sky, and I remembered that it looked like the porch ceiling of my grandmother's house. If you're a Southerner, you know that you paint your porch ceiling blue because it wards off wasps from building nests up there. They see it as an extension of the sky, and so they won't build a nest. And so she had a blue painted porch ceiling, and it just triggered a memory. And I remembered everything about sitting on her porch and her porch swing with her and reading from the library. She lived directly across the street from the library, and we walked over there all the time. And so I just kind of started typing my recollections of that one particular day, looking up at a porch swing, triggered by the color of the sky that was outside my office window. And I wrote a column about the meaning of that tiny, tiny experience. And that's what ended up running in the magazine as my very first editor's column. And really, I started crying when I wrote it. And so I think for me, just the understanding that stories should have meaning. When I was at Uncg, of course, I'm an English major. I don't have a journalism degree because, I have an English degree. And a lot of people in magazine publishing have a journalism degree, not an English degree. Of course, at Uncg, it's a focus on literary. And that's all we did was read stories. And so that experience that I had at school, and of course, staring out the window and making a recollection of sky color and tying it to my grandmother's front porch, I think sort of set the tone for how I wanted all these columns to sound. I've met so many people in this state who have had a profound effect on me just personally. Thousands of people who, have told me their life stories. I could just fill up, I don't know how many books just on profiles of the most exceptional and extraordinary people. There's a woman I know in Mount Airy who, teaches people to read. And I think I could never do something like that. It's so amazing. And, it's so interesting that you just see people and you don't realize the extraordinary stories they have to tell until you get to know them. This magazine, we were started in 1933, so it's been around for a long time. And you would think at some point we would run out of things to write about, but you don't, for that exact reason, because everybody has got an incredible story to tell. And I hope we're here for a long time to keep telling it.
I bet you will. You have several questions. I'm going to try to take these in order. And a couple of comments. You have, thank you, Elizabeth. You did an outstanding job. I traveled North Carolina with her. Thurman Worthington from Virginia Beach, Virginia.
Wonderful.
And many thanks for producing the best magazine ever printed. So let me take a couple of these. This is a great one. If you had $50 in one afternoon, where would you go and what would you do? Isn't that a great question?
That is such a great question. Well, $50 I'm going to eat. I will tell you that. Most of my trips in the state are organized or planned around food. In fact, on my phone, I keep a running list of all the places in this state that I have not been to and eaten and where I want to go have a meal. Oh my gosh, where would I mean, I've been I've been everywhere pretty much. I might go up to the mountains I'd say I'd go up to the mountains for a weekend at the Swag, but I can't do that on $50. So that's a little bit more than that. But a great meal in North Carolina for $50 and car driving money. Oh my gosh. I'd go to Nick's Hamburgers in Lexington and get a below your mind cheeseburger. I'd go get tacos at Tortuga's Lie in Kitty Hawk and Nag's Head. Oh man, that is such a great question. We could actually do an entire issue if you had $50. Where to go on $50 in North Carolina?
I think that is a great idea.
Down.
That is great. Another question is, what's your favorite place to take weekend visitors?
Well, it depends on where you live. I'm in Greensboro, so if I had a weekend visitor, depending on how much time we had and what the weather was like, I love Pilot Mountain. That's actually one of my favorite places in the state for a great hike. The geology of Pilot Mountain is so fascinating to me. If you're a subscriber, we had Pilot Mountain on our March cover, just the knob, and I love everything about that. I have taken picnics there, and when you do the trail around, I forget what the name of the trail is, but it's one of the trails up to the up around the knob. The rock outcropping kind of hangs underneath, and then there's more rocks in the middle, and you can actually sort of sit. It creates like a table, and you can have a picnic there and just see. You can see, the whole town of Mount Airy and into Winston, and as far as you can see far away, and it's just quiet and beautiful, and it's a huge bird nesting area, so you can see a lot of birds flying around there. I love it there. Of course, one of the places I mentioned in my talk is Seagrove, because I grew up in Randolph County and spent a lot of time growing up going to the Potters. My grandmother took me to the Pottery. We went pretty much every weekend and just roamed around down there. And that is that's a great day trip. It's a good weekend trip. I love going over to Raleigh. There's so much to do. I'm kind of a museum junkie, and the Museum of Art in Raleigh, the North Carolina Museum of Art, is one of the most spectacular museums, I think, in the state. Our November issue is actually devoted to museums, so you can get some great ideas from that. Hickory is another wonderful town that I love. It's just hard to say. A week, of course, Asheville is always fun. It depends on what somebody wants to do. If they're outdoorsy, if they want to experience North Carolina's beer scene, which is amazing right now. Culture, it's just hard to pinpoint one specific thing.
And that's a good thing, right? Oh gosh, here's a controversial one. What's the best barbecue in North Carolina?
Come on now. Don't get me in trouble. We can't. But I will say, again, I grew up in Randolph County. So if you look at a map, you could probably figure out whether I'm an Eastern style or Lexington style person, just being from down in that area. Of course, I love, all the Lexington barbecues are some of my favorites. We did a great piece years ago about Bee's Barbecue in Greenville. And in fact, our writer who's on staff is Jeremy Markovich. He's just a wonderful writer. And he spent a night overnight to experience the whole, with the smoker and all of that. And that barbecue is extraordinary. There's almost, I think, over 200 barbecue places in North Carolina. And they're all, you kind of think, are they all the same? They're not all the same. In Greensboro, I love Stamey's, and I love Country Barbecue, which is really great. They actually have a tenderloin biscuit that is so good. It's not, of course it's pork, not barbecue, but man, somebody bring me a tenderloin biscuit. I wouldn't hate that.
Well, we do have one in the chat from one of our beloved political science professors, Jeff Colbert, and he would like to know, as an alumna, what are some of your favorite memories from UNCG?
Oh, that I can talk about on this. I'm just joking. Well, man, I was an English major, so most of my time at UNCG was spent in a building called McKeever. If you know the old McKeever building, they tore the building down, which is heartbreaking to me. And I know people had mixed reactions to the building. Some people thought it was just an eyesore and not attractive. But that building held so much for me. I was there, it seemed like morning, noon, and night. So everything about McKeever and just roaming those halls and just kind of hanging out outside. A lot of people, when I was in school in the early 90s, people would just sit and smoke cigarettes and do whatever they did in the early 90s, with our flannel shirts on and our dark lipstick and grunge look. And so I remember all of that. I love UNCG in the fall. I think the campus is so beautiful. The library is still one of my favorite places, just the tower. I even know, it's funny, I even keep, again, a list on my phone of which floors house which things I need to go see. There's a great collection of magazines, bound magazines, like old gourmet magazines, old New Yorker magazines, old Oxford American magazines that I look at to get a lot of inspiration from. And so I can spend a lot of time in there. It is like just a repository of amazingness and knowledge. And, I will just pick a floor that I know nothing about, fourth floor, say, and just roam around in the library. That might be a crazy thing to do. I don't know. But I love. Of course, I'll say homecoming last year was so special, just seeing the bonfire and everything that went on for homecoming festivities. I'm glad we're able to connect virtually, and I'll be glad next year when we're back on campus.
Agreed. Agreed.
When I was a student there, they didn't have any of the parking decks built yet. And so we parked on the streets everywhere, anywhere you would just drive around just looking for a parking place that might take an hour to find.
Still does, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
I think we have one last one before we wrap out our evening. And this is from Jerry Edwards. He asked, have you been to Old Fort lately? And to what do you attribute its expansion into tourism after all these years?
Oh, wow. That is a question that I don't think I can answer. I haven't been to Old Fort in a while, although, we may do something with the place next year, because every time I drive to Asheville and pass around Swannanoa and Old Fort, I think I need to go in there and look around. So I'm not really aware much of the expansion or what the reason would be, although I do think, because Asheville has gotten so, it's just a swell now. It's so huge. I do think you were going to see a lot of these mountain communities, like what happened with Black Mountain and some of these smaller mountain communities, really start to grow from the extension of Asheville, just sort of the same way, how Pittsboro evolved because of Chapel Hill and Research Triangle Park, and so places like that. I don't know if that's the reason, because, like I say, I haven't been over there in probably 2 years maybe, so couldn't tell you exactly the reason. A lot of people too who grow up in a place and they move away and they go off to school or they, whatever. I've seen this in so many towns where they'll have a family and they want to come back to the place where they grew up or where they started, or maybe where their parents are or grandparents. And when younger people move back to a place, they kind of bring with them amenities that they had in their bigger towns. They want a coffee shop, they want a yoga studio, they want things that maybe some of these smaller places didn't have. And that tends to create some positive progressive growth. I've seen this in my own hometown of Asheboro. When I was growing up, it was a dry town. And now, there's just a great, extraordinary brewery there. There's some really good restaurants. I mean, it just is a different place from what I remember. And I love seeing that all over North Carolina. Just this, really beautiful growth that comes because people care about where they live and want to make it better.
Well, before we close this evening, there's so many comments of gratitude here, and bear with me. Let me read just a couple. Catherine Sykes, amazing storytelling. Thank you so much. Ann Overcash, awesome. Thank you for so many familiar places. You have one from someone you know who was featured in one of your issues, Alice Irby. Elizabeth, you're always good. Such a joy to see you and listen to your memories. Gail Austin, thank you for the wonderful Travelogue today and for every wonderful issue of Our State. It's a treasure. I enjoyed this so much. Thanks for producing the best magazine ever. You are beloved, and you're a treasure to all of us and to North Carolina. And we cannot thank you enough for spending your evening with us tonight. And we're so grateful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And to all our attendees that asked, we will send out a list of the places that Elizabeth mentioned so that you can pick up her roadmap and walk a little bit in her shoes. So, Elizabeth, thank you. Have a good evening. To everybody that joined us, thank you so much. Happy homecoming. And Elizabeth, thank you for truly putting the home in our homecoming.
Thank you, Mary, and everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.